Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third lecture together. Today, we're going to talk about the agricultural sector in developing countries, and we're going to see how the sharecropping contract that we now know how does it work, how does it perform compared to other forms of agreement, like, for example, the fixed rent agreement or the owner cultivation agreement. We're also going to see how the type of agreement that we choose can impact productivity, and we're going to see that both empirically and theoretically. Actually, we will see a theoretical model first together, and then we're going to see a couple of papers that produce empirical results. So we're going to look at the econometrics, and we're going to study the condition under which we can have a positive impact, the type of agreement we can establish a relationship, a causal relationship with the productivity of the land. First of all, let's talk about some stylized facts. There's evidence by Barry Klein that small farms are usually more productive than the large ones. So there's an inverse relationship between the size of the farm and the productivity. We have seen, and we will see, that the sharecropping is widely used, but compared to other forms of agreement, which are the one that we just mentioned, like the owner cultivation or the fixed rent tenancy, the productivity in terms of efficiency is actually lower. Therefore, these two statements provide us with the conclusion, in some sense, that if we implement a land reform, we will see one than in India, we can have an effect on productivity. So there is evidence, in fact, and we will see that the land reform, and in particular tenants agreement, can improve productivity. And if it's quite, we can say maybe more straightforward, the idea that there's an inverse relationship between the size and the productivity. When we look at for example, the diminishing return to land, is a little bit less intuitive than why the productivity, the type of agreement, can affect the productivity. And in particular, we're going to see that most of the time, the problem between the agreement and the productivity goes through the problem of incentives. So the type of incentive that I provide the individual with are going to affect the way in which they treat the land, the way in which they invest on the land, and therefore, in the last, as a last consequence, is going to impact the productivity. One of the questions that we might ask, if agency costs, and in particular asymmetries in information, generate some issues, why the market doesn't automatically get rid of those, why they do not get solved. So today, as I just said, we're going to study what are these friction, where do they come from in the land market, and what type of informational problem can actually generate, and how the type of agreement that we might choose or agree to sign can be considered as a response, can be considered a way to which the professional do actually take care, or the governments take care of the informational issues. So the two research questions that we will try to address are, first of all, what determines the type of agreement that I observe in a country when you come to land distribution? And as you might have already anticipated, if this type of agreement does affect productivity, why does not everyone goes for the most efficient organization? What are the elements that prevent the most efficient organization or type of agreement to become the more popular one? These are the two questions that we're going to answer in this lecture. But first of all, let's start from the beginning. Let's go to see why the sharecropping agreement perform in a less efficient way compared to other agreements that we mentioned. So first of all, we have to notice that if you have a type of distribution which is different from country to country, you might have different type of rental contract. For example, in Latin America, the fixed rent is very popular. In Asia, instead, it's more about the sharecropping. How do we define the sharecropping? Now we probably know all about it. So a landlord allows a tenant to farm its land for a fixed amount of the product that she produced. This percentage that we saw, for example, last week, calculated as, for example, a percentage alpha with the linear sharing rule, for example, can change from country to country. In Indonesia, for example, usually is about 60% for the landlord of every crop produced. Some other form, for example, instead include a 50-50 split. So if you remember what we saw last week, alpha for the tenant and 1 minus alpha for the landlord, where this alpha, as we just said, could be 50%, 60%, whatever. The sharecropping agreement, we might anticipate, but we will see that better later on, that it might be quite useful when both landlord and tenant are risk averse. Remember that when we discussed the principal agent model from the theoretical generic framework, we said that usually the principal is the one that has a higher bargaining power. And the reason why is that is because he can rely, for example, on more wealth. So he has maybe easier access to credit. So he can rely in some sense on some wealth that can protect him towards adversity, towards the bad luck. This is slightly more complicated and different for the agent, which usually is considered the weaker party in the contract, which usually, especially if you think about it in a developing country and in the sharecropping agreement, maybe cannot rely on land because doesn't own any other asset, doesn't own any animal, for example, or does not have access to credit in a facilitated way. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, it might be definitely more risk averse than its counterpart, the landlord. As I said to you at the beginning, in order to understand why an agreement that in principle is less efficient, is not that efficient compared to others, we have to define, we can call it a reference point against which we want to compare the sharecropping. And we start by comparing the sharecropping agreement towards the fixed rent, for example. Consider a landlord that owns some land and a tenant that rents this land from the landlord. They sign a contract according to which the tenant has to pay a rent, and the rent function can be, for example, defined in the following way. R equal to alpha times Y as a function of L. Well, in this case, L is labor, so is the input labor. And we assume that is a standard production function. So first derivative is actually positive and the second derivative will be negative. So a standard concave production function. Now, if you look at this function and we assume alpha equal to 0 and F positive, we're going to have a fixed rent contract. So the tenant, no matter what is going to be the output, it will have to pay this amount F positive. Whereas instead, if F is equal to 0 and alpha is in between 0 and 1, and we said before it can be 60%, 40%, then we are in front of a sharecropping contract. So let's have a look to this function. So this is our production function, concave, as we just said. On the y-axis, we have the output and costs, and on the x-axis, we have labor. So the function grows at decreasing returns for the towards labor. So first derivative is positive and second is negative. And then we have some linear cost, production costs, which is a linear function of labor. Now, where do we find the optimal level of labor, optimal amount of labor that maximize our product? So how much input do I have to produce? So how much labor as an input do I have to put in my production function so that I get maximize my production? As you can see graphically, this is given where the distance between the production function and the cost function is actually maximum, which happen exactly here. And in this point, as you know, the first derivative, so the slope of the production function, which is given by this tangent here to the function, is exactly equal to the slope of the production cost. So we know that in this point, the marginal product is equal to the marginal cost. They both have the same slope, both functions have the same slope, and therefore the corresponding level of optimal level of labor will be the one indicated below. So consider now a fixed rent agreement. In a fixed rent agreement, we know that the farmer has to pay an amount F, which is positive, and therefore she will not be able to keep all the output, right? So compared to the situation that we saw before, which is this one here, if you remove the amount of rent F from the function, so you won't be able to keep all the products, this difference here, since we are basically reducing the intercept of this function, because we are reducing the same amount from the entire product, is going to be represented by the fixed rent. Now, what can you see? When you reduce your product by the rent, basically what you're going to do, you're going to move the function. The function is basically moving, but not changing shape, a little bit downwards. So we have a shift downwards of the function, which corresponds exactly to the amount of fixed rent. What are the consequences for the optimal level of labor? As you can see, none, because since we are reshaping this shift, the production function downward, the optimal level of labor will be still given by the point in which the new production function, the one shifted below, has the maximum distance from the cost function, sorry. And this is still happen here. So as you can see, in terms of efficiency, the optimal amount of labor has not changed compared to the previous case. So the best outcome, or the first best outcome, is still reached. So we still are using the same amount of input that we saw in the previous case. The previous case can be considered the owner cultivation. So where the tenant, let me write it down here, where the tenant gets to keep basically all the output, as if the product was, as if he was actually working for his own land or own his own land. Is the owner, he gets to keep all the output. In here, he's not the owner anymore, he doesn't get to keep all the output, but still the optimal amount of labor remains exactly the same. What happened in the sharecropping contract? In the sharecropping contract, we know that the farmer pays the rent, which look like the one that we can see on the slide here. So F is now equal to 0, and alpha is in between 0 and 1. Again, the tenant doesn't get to keep all the output, but now what does happen? And I want to show you that with a simple example. Consider two different values of output and let alpha be equal to 1/2, so a 50-50 split between the landlord and the tenant. Assume I'm the tenant. If I produce 10 apples, I get to keep 5, and the amount 5, the remaining 5, will be given to the landlord. How about if I produce more? 20. Again, I get to keep 10, but also the landlord gets to keep 10. So as you can see, the more I produce, the higher will be the rent also from the landlord. From a mathematical point of view, what are we changing here now? We're not changing the intercept of the function, but we are changing the slope, because this alpha here basically represents the slope of our function. So in this case, compared to before, where alpha was actually equal to 1, what we're going to have, that the slope is going to get half of that. If this is the new function, this is our old function. If the E1 is our new function, now the maximum distance with the production cost we have not changed is reached here. And as you can see, the new value, optimal input value for the labor is actually smaller than the one we were having before. So as the production increases, we know that the rent increases as well. Therefore, the production function bends inwards, and this basically reduces the incentive to produce higher and higher amounts. Why is that? Because as this example, this small example, this example number can tell you, you see that here, the more I produce and the more the landlord will get as well. I will definitely get more, but also the landlord. In the previous case, in the fixed rent, I know as a tenant that once I have paid my rent, F, which is fixed, all the rest can be taken for own production. So let's say the rent is fixed like 50. If I produce 100, once I paid 50, I get to keep the other 50. But if I produce 200, I still have to pay 50. So I get to keep 150. If I produce 300, so on and so forth. So if the rent is fixed, once that's paid, all the excess over the rent of the project can be kept by the tenant, not in the sharecropping case. Therefore, because the incentive to produce and to produce input is actually smaller compared to the owner cultivation, we can say, but also fixed rent, we can say that the sharecropping is actually less efficient than the other two types of agreement. So in terms of conclusion of results, what can we say about it? First of all, the sharecropping results in an undersupply of farming output. Why is that? Less input. Remember that Y is a function of L. So if L is smaller, the Y will be smaller as well, compared to the other two, contract ownership or fixed rent. But if it's so inefficient, why is so popular, and why, as we have seen in many countries, this is the most popular type of agreement that you will get? we can identify, and we're going to discuss, 3 possible explanations. The first one is the trade-off between incentive and insurance. Think about the model that you saw before, because that we saw when we discussed the sharecropping in detail, and how we can tweak the reward schedule to change the incentive. The intuition is provided by this. If the tenant and the landlord have a different risk aversion, which depends on their wealth, and we mentioned that before, there is an incentive problem, right? Because as a tenant, because the amount of input that I produce, so the amount of labor that I put in, is unobservable, and remember that it costs me effort, it costs me a disutility. Do you remember we named this disutility psi to produce effort? I will have, as a tenant, an incentive to put in the minimum effort required not to get fired, and nothing else. And the landlord doesn't want to use a wage contract either. Why? Because if he is going to use a wage contract, then he's going to pay the tenant always the same amount. But then if the tenant doesn't have any incentive to produce more, this is what it will happen. So there is an incentive and an insurance problem, because remember, because of the risk aversion, the tenants want insurance, and therefore sharecropping is something that will insure him when, remember what did we say? Because of the linear sharing contract, if alpha, if y lower bar, for example, is actually equal to 0, the amount that I get to keep is 0, but also the amount that I have to pay to the landlord is going to be equal to 0, because I'm going to have 1 minus alpha times 0. If this is the case, I know as a tenant that in the worst case scenario, I will not have to pay anything. That provides me with some insurance. The other problem is the limited liability issue. So if there is so much the tenants can pay in any state of the world, because we said that there is a limited liability constraint that in the linear sharing rule version of the sharecropping is automatically satisfied, the tenants will have enough resources to survive, or will need in each state enough resources to survive. But if this is the case and the tenants get lots of insurance in the bad state, it means that the only way that the landlord can provide incentive is by rewarding the good state a lot, because only when the gap between the reward of the bad state, the insurance in the worst case, and the reward in the good case is very wide, then you're going to provide to the tenant enough incentive for him to exert the high level of effort. I usually make an example to students that they can immediately understand. Let's say, for example, that in the final exam, I say that I'm going to provide everyone, whoever does even just a tiny bit of the answer, with 55. So the minimum grade that you will get, even if you fail, is going to be 55. Now, there might be many of you that will say, I'm happy with 55. I'm not going to do any work because this will be my reward in the worst case scenario. But there will be a lot of you that are not happy with 55 and would like to study a lot to get 100. Let's increase this 55. Let's make it now 65. Let's make it 85. The higher is the, possibly we can say, parachute value, parachute grade that you will get in the worst case scenario, the smaller will be the percentage of you all the time, they will be happy to study a lot more to gain this, I don't know, 15 extra points, 15 extra mark from 85 to 100. So you see, if the gap between what you get in the worst case scenario and the, let's say, rewards that you get in the good scenario is really small, you don't have any incentive to work a lot, to exert effort that costs you this utility to gain that much. 85 to 100. Who's going to do that, right? Say, I'm happy with 85. I'm not going to do any work because what I'm going to earn more by studying a lot is just what? If I'm lucky, if everything goes well, 15 points. But if this gap is really wide, then there will be a lot of you that despite the parachute or despite the insurance that you get in the worst case scenario, will be happy to exert effort to top it up and get 100. So whenever there is, like in this case, a limited liability for the tenant in some sense is very much insured. So he will be very happy to accept a contract like this, because to a tenant which is usually poor, in a disadvantaged condition, with no access to credit, with very small or none other assets to rely on in terms of wealth, the sharecropping provides him with a lot of insurance. Now, what the landlord must do in order to have still some incentive, still having the tenant to exert the high level of effort, is to make the gap with the good reward a lot higher. Why? Because he cannot act on the lower level. He cannot act on the punishment, because this is limited by the existence of the limited liability. The last motive, which in some sense you can consider as a synthesis of what we've seen before, is that if we need to have a lot of incentive for the tenants to work on the land, we have to have also the landlord interested in working in the farm. Why? Because the farm, the land might need some investment in terms of, I don't know, new water supplies or tilling equipment, some new machine to work the land, some new kettles to, help to plow the land. If the landlord has no incentive to invest in his land, then maybe the tenant will not be interested in accepting a contract for that land either. If there is a fixed rent, so if the landlord knows that whatever investment he made, even none, is going to get a fixed amount of rent from the tenant, then he has no incentive into making this investment. Why? Because he has a guaranteed income. Exactly as the wage contract will be for the tenant. So in order to have both parties incentivized in work properly on the land, we have to make sure that the compensation that they get is a function of the final product in both ways. Remember what we said, alpha times y for the tenant, but 1 minus alpha for, 1 minus alpha times y for the landlord. So when both parties involved in the contract, like the sharecropping, have a compensation, a final outcome, which depends on the effort produced, then both parties have an incentive to make their own share of investment. Labor for the tenant, but other investments in, for example, in capital, machinery for the landlord. If they both do not get a guaranteed outcome, no matter what the production is, then they both have incentive to do their own part. So because of the trade-off between incentive and insurance, because of the insurance that the sharecropping contract is offers to the party with less wealth and probably therefore more risk averse. Because of the incentive that a compensation which is linked to the final outcome produced by the land that the sharecropping contract can offer, despite being less efficient in terms of quantity of input and therefore quantity of output produced, the sharecropping contract is very widely used. So, as you can see from all the things that we have said, agency costs and in particular asymmetries in information do play a very big role in the sharecropping contract because they can alter the amount of effort exerted, and because they change the incentive of people, eventually they're going to get change the productivity. In the next video, we're going to talk about in more detail of this paper, empowerment and efficiency, and we're going to see both the theoretical part first, and then later on we're going to see the empirical results, so that we can see in an applied situation, in a reform that were actually introduced in India, how incentive, how the asymmetries in information provide different type of agreement, and when you change the type of agreement, you can have an impact on productivity.